A graveyard in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan holds a tombstone carved in 1338. One word etched into the stone stopped archaeologists completely: pestilence. 9 years before the Black Death reached Europe and killed half the continent, something was already killing people in a remote trading village on the Silk Road. Something that moved fast enough to bury over 100 people in 2 years. Something that inscriptions recorded but nobody understood until DNA testing finally read what those stones were actually saying. The Black Death killed an estimated 50 to 60% of Europe's population between 1347 and 1353. Entire cities emptied. Families wiped out within days. The social structure of medieval civilization collapsed under the weight of corpses, piling faster than they could be buried. In some regions, the mortality rate approached 90%. Villages disappeared entirely, their populations reduced to nothing but empty houses and overgrown fields. For over 600 years, one question haunted everyone who studied it. Where did it start? Every theory pointed somewhere different: China, Mongolia, India, the steppes of Central Asia, the Middle East. Scholars argued for centuries based on fragmentary historical accounts, conflicting chronicles, and educated guesses built on incomplete information. Nobody could prove anything definitively because the disease moved too fast, covered too much ground, and left behind more questions than answers in every place it touched. Then, in 2022, a team published findings in the journal Nature that answered the question using DNA extracted from teeth buried in a cemetery that was excavated in 1886 and then forgotten for over a century in a Russian museum archive. They found ground zero. Let me take you through how they found it, because the story starts with a detail that sat collecting dust for 136 years before anyone understood what it meant. Summer of 1886. A Russian archaeological team is working two small cemeteries near a village called Kyrgyzstan, close to the northern shore of Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan. Mountain valleys sitting over 6,000 feet above sea level. A community that had been a stopping point on one of the Silk Road's many branches centuries earlier. It is positioned where traders moving between China and the West would rest, resupply, and exchange goods before continuing their journeys. They uncovered dozens of graves, Nestorian Christians based on the tombstone inscriptions carved in ancient Syriac script. The dates on the stones clustered tightly: 1338 and 1339. That detail mattered more than the excavators realized at the time. 1338 was nearly a full decade before the Black Death first appeared in European historical records. A full 9 years before ships arrived at Italian ports in 1347, carrying something that would reshape the continent permanently and irreversibly. Among the tombstones they documented, one inscription read clearly: "This is the tomb of the believer Sanmak. He died of pestilence." Pestilence, in medieval terminology, a vague but deeply ominous catch-all word for any catastrophic disease that could devastate a community. Not specific enough to identify exactly what killed someone, but specific enough to mark the death as part of something larger and more terrible than the normal background mortality rate every community experienced. The archaeologists documented everything meticulously, drew maps, took detailed field notes, photographed the tombstones, brought the skeletal remains back to St. Petersburg for storage in the Peter the Great Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography. Then the findings were cataloged, filed away in the museum archive, and largely forgotten while the world moved on and the skeletons sat in storage for over a century. In recent years, a medieval historian named Philip Slavin at the University of Stirling in Scotland was deep into researching the economic and environmental history surrounding the Black Death when he stumbled across those old Russian excavation records while searching through digitized archives. One detail jumped out immediately: an anomaly in the burial numbers that didn't make sense for a small trading settlement operating under normal conditions. Between 1338 and 1339, over 118 people from this single small community had died and been buried. A significant percentage of tombstones explicitly mentioned pestilence as the cause of death. The math was simple and disturbing. In a village of maybe a few hundred people total, losing over 100 in 2 years, isn't normal mortality from disease, accident, and old age. Or it's a mortality crisis. It's something catastrophic happening to the community. Slavin was almost certain this was the Black Death appearing 9 years earlier than anyone thought it existed, in a location nobody had considered as the origin point. But conviction isn't proof. A historian's theory, however well researched and logically compelling, can't replace hard physical evidence that can be tested and verified. To prove it, he would need DNA extracted from those skeletons that had been sitting in St. Petersburg since 1886. When Slavin presented his findings and his theory to the broader academic community, paleogeneticists at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany recognized immediately what they were looking at, a potential answer to a question their own research had been circling without being able to close. The Max Planck team had spent years building a massive genetic family tree for Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. They had collected and sequenced over 1,300 samples from modern and ancient sources across the globe. Rodents, human victims, burial sites from multiple continents spanning centuries, every strain they could find, sequence, and map. What they found in that accumulated data was a striking pattern. In the early 14th century, right around the time the Black Death emerged, the bacterium underwent what geneticists describe as a big bang of diversification. From a single ancestral strain, 4 new major lineages of plague suddenly appeared nearly simultaneously, as branching out like an explosion captured in genetic code. One of those 4 lineages was responsible for the Black Death in Europe and every subsequent plague outbreak across the following 400 years. The genetic signature was unmistakable across centuries of samples. But here's what the genetic data showed with absolute clarity. The strains found in European Black Death victims from the 1347 to 1353 period already carried 1 or 2 mutations away from the source. They were evolutionary descendants, children of an earlier strain, not the original parent. The true origin, the ancestral strain that gave birth to all 4 lineages, had to be somewhere else, somewhere earlier. Somewhere that the unmutated source existed before it diversified and spread across continents. A collaboration formed between Slavic and Russian researchers at the Peter the Great Museum, where the Kyrgyzstan skeletons had been stored since the 1880s. The challenge was significant. Extracting usable DNA from 680-year-old skeletal remains is difficult under the best conditions: degradation, contamination from handling, environmental exposure. Any of these factors can destroy the genetic material you're trying to recover. The team focused on teeth. Specifically, they extracted DNA from the dental pulp inside 7 individuals' teeth. Teeth are nearly ideal for this kind of work because the pulp chamber inside can retain traces of blood-borne pathogens for centuries, protected from environmental degradation by the dense enamel surrounding it, like a natural sealed container. The extraction process is painstaking. You're drilling carefully into ancient teeth in sterile laboratory conditions, extracting microscopic amounts of material, amplifying the DNA fragments, sequencing what remains. The results came back. In 3 of the 7 individuals tested, they found the unmistakable genetic signature of Yersinia pestis. The pestilence of 1338 was plague, confirmed at the molecular level. Then they sequenced the full genome of the ancient bacterium, recovered from those 3 positive samples, and compared it against their global family tree of plague strains spanning centuries and continents. Perfect match. The strain from the 1,338 Kyrgyzstan victims wasn't just another plague strain branching somewhere along the evolutionary tree. It was the ancestral strain, the one sitting at the exact point of origin for that Big Bang diversification event they had identified in their earlier research. It was the mother of them all, the source from which all 4 major lineages, including the one that devastated Europe, had emerged. They had found the geographic and temporal ground zero of the Black Death. With time and place confirmed through DNA evidence, the next question was how. How does a bacterium living quietly in wild animal populations for potentially thousands of years suddenly jump into human populations with enough force to kill half of Europe within a decade? The process is called zoonotic spillover, a pathogen crossing the species barrier from its natural animal reservoir host into human populations, where it can establish transmission chains. The region around Lake Issyk-Kul in the Tian Shan Mountains is what epidemiologists call a natural plague reservoir, a geographic area where the bacterium circulates continuously and indefinitely among vast populations of wild rodents, marmots, great gerbils, voles. The disease has been endemic in these animal populations for thousands of years, moving through rodent communities without ever threatening humans on any significant scale. The researchers proposed a climate-driven trigger based on environmental data from the period. Evidence from tree ring analysis and other climate proxies suggests the region experienced unusually warm and wet springs in the years leading up to 1338. Mild winters followed by good growing seasons. The local vegetation flourished in response to these ideal conditions. More vegetation meant exponentially more food available for rodent populations. More food meant population explosions among the marmot and gerbil communities that are the natural hosts for plague. More rodents packed into limited geographic areas meant more opportunities for fleas carrying Yersinia pestis to jump between individual hosts. A crowded, thriving rodent ecosystem created mathematically perfect conditions for the bacterium to make the evolutionary jump from its established natural hosts to something new and vulnerable: humans. A single marmot hunted for meat or fur could have been the initial bridge, one infected animal butchered by someone in the community. One flea bite during the processing, one bacterial transmission crossing the species barrier. From there, the disease could move person to person with devastating efficiency once it adapted to human hosts. But the final piece of the puzzle was the journey. How did a localized outbreak in a remote mountain valley travel over 3,500 kilometers to reach the Black Sea ports where it made its European debut in 1346? The graves provided the answer. Many people buried at Kyrgyzstan were interred with possessions from distant lands: pearls from the Indian Ocean, coins from Iran, textiles from the Mediterranean. These weren't isolated villagers. They were merchants and traders on the Silk Road connecting China to Europe through thousands of miles of caravan routes. Their camel caravans carried silk, spices, and goods west toward European markets. Hidden in that cargo were black rats, and on those rats were infected fleas. The caravans became mobile transmission vectors, carrying the plague from one trading post to the next across Central Asia. Each stop represented new spillover. Each infected community sent traders further along the network. Eventually, this chain reached the Crimean Peninsula and the besieged port city of Kaffa in 1346. Historical accounts describe Mongol forces, themselves suffering from plague, catapulting corpses of their own dead over the city walls into the defending Genoese population. One of history's earliest documented instances of biological warfare. From Kaffa, panicked Genoese ships fled toward Italy carrying infected rats and fleas. Europe's dense populations and unsanitary medieval cities created perfect conditions for what followed. Half the continent dead within 7 years. Social structures collapsed. The medieval world permanently transformed, but the origin sat forgotten in a mountain graveyard for 6 centuries, until DNA technology connected the dots that archaeology and history alone couldn't prove. A tombstone carved in 1338 with one word: pestilence. The DNA confirmed what that word meant, and where the Black Death actually began. Drop your theory about what other historical mysteries DNA might solve next in the comments. And subscribe for more discoveries where modern science answers questions that have been sitting unanswered for centuries. Because sometimes the past leaves evidence that takes hundreds of years and technology that didn't exist to finally read correctly.